Welcome everyone to the last talk of Women in Product 2023. My name is Didem Sarukaya and I'm a Senior Product Manager at 10x Genomics. And I'm really excited to wrap things up by talking about the power of product hypotheses, how you can take a scientific approach to your strategy. As product managers, we're managing a lot of moving parts and tasks on a day-to-day basis. So you have your product roadmap, you have to balance that with feature requests, tech debt issues, and bugs, and all of that needs to be timed appropriately for your launches as well as your company's goals. And in addition to that, we need to be tackling customer discovery and looking through our analytics to make sure our decisions are sound. And I think when presented with all these overwhelming options, we often rely on quantitative prioritization frameworks to deal with them. So I'm showing an example from the RICE framework, which it requires you to estimate your reach, multiply that by impact and confidence, and then divide that by effort. And there are a lot of other quantitative frameworks available, and the goal is to have a value assigned to your feature or your activity so you can stack rank them and decide what's most important. And in these cases, you'll find that you have to list your assumptions, but there's nothing that really requires that you test them. And it's very easy to get attached to a number because it feels like it's more quantitative and rigorous, whereas it actually has a lot of your assumptions baked into it and you need to test them. So to make the best decisions, it's important that you always think about your perceptions and proactively think about testing them. This is particularly important to me because I come from a scientific background. I have a PhD in genetics, and this is a picture of me from my PhD days with my favorite microscope, because I did have a favorite microscope, looking at a picture of a fruit fly ovary. And when I was presented with these challenges as a product manager of weighing my options and doing these quantitative frameworks, I went back to my scientific training for inspiration. And the scientific method relies heavily on writing and testing hypotheses. And hypotheses are an idea that proposes a tentative explanation about a phenomenon that is falsifiable and testable. And what I appreciate a lot about hypotheses over thinking about assumptions is that when you pose a hypothesis, your intention is to test them. And I think it's a very helpful perspective to have as a product manager. So I decided to tackle my product as a series of hypotheses. And I proposed my product hypothesis to be the best answer to your product questions that you will use to evaluate and test your perceptions. There are also a lot of other definitions out there in the world about product hypotheses. And I think the key component to remember is that it's your best guess and it's meant to be tested. So for the rest of the talk, I'll focus on 5 easy steps to write your product hypotheses and include them in your day-to-day activities. At 10x Genomics, we make cutting-edge research tools for medical and biology researchers, and our customers are using our research products on a daily basis and making really groundbreaking discoveries. At the product team at 10x, our goal is to make products that help researchers make sense of complex biological data sets. So this snapshot that you see is Loop Browser, the product that I manage, and the cloud of colorful dots that you see actually represent a single cell from multiple lung cancer samples that were treated with drugs or not treated. And it's just an example of the kind of data that our customers are using. And my goal through Loop Browser is to accelerate them to be able to extract biological insight and know what kind of experiments they want to follow up with. Now, this is the end of the conference. It's end of a Wednesday. I don't want to necessarily put you through the ringer of biology and complex data analysis. So for this particular framework, I'm actually going to borrow from a different part of my life where I run my business, Just Goats Pottery, where I make and sell ceramics exclusively featuring goats. So I'm going to use the goat pottery as inspiration to walk through the 5 steps of writing product hypotheses. And I hope what you will find is that it really doesn't matter what kind of product you have. It's really about the way you think and approach problems. And the 5 steps I'll walk through is how to convert your product questions into hypotheses, how to structure your hypotheses, iterate your hypotheses so that they're insightful even if you're wrong, throw in good controversy, and iterate with feedback and research. And I invite you to follow along in the chat box. Is there a product question that comes to mind as you're thinking about this? Is there something you'd really like to find out and maybe you haven't had a lot of time to think about? Share it in the chat box and let's revise it together. And I'll be in there commenting along the way. So the first step is to write and convert your questions into hypotheses. So as you're thinking about yours and sharing it in the chat box, I'll share some of mine that I had when I started my goat pottery business. I had questions like, will focusing on goats work? How much work should I put into one piece? And what's the right price for my product? These were things I wanted to know so I could run a better business and make better ceramic products. And to convert them into hypotheses, you just have to write down your best guess answer. And I want to emphasize, you don't want to spend a lot of detailed time thinking about the perfect sentence. You just have to put down your best guess answer. So think about your question that you shared in the chat box and think about what you think is the right answer. In my case, it was specializing on goats will allow me to stand out. Customers want well-crafted and intricate pieces. And having a range of prices will help target a wider audience. And I thought these three major statements captured most of the things that I wanted to know and test about my business. So as you're converting your questions into hypotheses, what you'll find is that you'll have the first list of your core hypotheses. The next step is to structure them. So you might find that a single sentence just doesn't really capture what you want to say about your product. You're going to have other things you want to document. And those can be put down as your sub-hypotheses. So think about the statement that you made, your hypothesis, and come up with a couple of things that you also think are true about that particular line of question that you're thinking about. So for example, I thought in terms of goats and standing out that customers like novelty products and that they can talk about. And I also thought customers care about having one-of-a-kind and unique products. So I'm picturing a plate featuring a goat named Sohi. She's a real goat. And she lives out there in El Dorado Hills in California. And I thought customers would like the fact that they could talk about an actual goat that is living out there and is hand-painted and handcrafted. The other hypothesis that I had relating to well-crafted pieces was that customers would want a variety of product types. And I also thought along with that they'd want cheaper items because that would help me gain traction. So I made a lot of different items like mugs, ornaments, plates, and stickers. And these were all things that went into what I was doing, and it captured the way I was approaching my product. So as you're jotting down your sub-hypotheses, think about how you want to add more color to the main question that you want to answer. Step 3 is my absolute favorite, which is that a hypothesis should be designed so that you can gain insight even if you're wrong. And if you don't remember a single thing I said today, I hope you remember this. When you write a hypothesis, it should be interesting regardless of whether you guessed right or wrong. And this is really critical so you don't find yourself wasting time. So for example, one of my core hypotheses was that specializing on goats will allow me to stand out. This is actually a pretty bad hypothesis because it's hard to test. There's no other goat potters out there. And if I'm wrong, I don't know really where to go with it. Is it the goats that's the problem? Should I have focused on alpacas? Is it that I'm not standing out in the right way? It's just not really well worded. And the goal here is actually just to keep revising them so that they make more sense and they're more testable. So I'm going to fix my hypothesis to say having a specific concept is better than investing in a broad range of aesthetics. This is a much better hypothesis because it's more easily validated and it provides insight even if I'm wrong. So I can go and look at successful crafters. I can look through their Instagrams and look through their progression of their craft. And I could see, are they following a specific concept? And if they're not, I can look at the second part, which is what kind of other things I could do to broaden my range of aesthetics. You can iterate this to get to a more specific answer. And that's really the beauty of this step. So your hypothesis may be perfectly fine, but looking through yours, if you can think of a way to make it more interesting, even if you're wrong, add it along in the chat box. Or if you have any comments on other hypotheses and refining them, that would be great too. The fourth step is throwing in good controversy. I'm borrowing this term from Priya Parker's book, Art of Gathering, where she talks about when you bring people together, it's really important to have something objectionable for people to react to. And I think this is true for any kind of hypotheses and thinking that you're doing, because you need to find your perception gaps. And if you only write down things that everyone's going to agree on, it's not really going to be very interesting because you're not really pushing your mindset further. So in my case, I had these two main hypotheses about well-crafted and intricate pieces, as well as the price range. And something that I thought was quite controversial was that details of the craft is less important for customers who want a novelty item. I didn't necessarily believe this to be true, but it was a thought I had and I wanted to test it. And you may not think this is very controversial, but amongst crafters, this is a pretty controversial statement. There are a lot of people who believe that you need to have the finest and most beautifully made, intricate piece before you even go out to sell. I can easily test this. So here are two examples. The top is the plate that's hand painted and hand carved. It takes a lot of time to make. It's really one of a kind. It's really hard to sort of make something that looks like that consistently. And it's one of a kind and detailed. The bottom one also features a goat and flowers, but it's done through a technique called monoprinting. It's still unique in that it's hand painted, but it takes a lot less time and it's a lot less detailed. And it doesn't have that textural element of the carving. So I could sell these two side by side and I could test this hypothesis that, again, is pretty controversial. And I would be able to think about things in a different way. So what is controversial to you about your hypothesis? Is there something that you want to throw in there that you think people might react to? And I'd love for everybody else to react to each other's controversial statements to see if it's actually controversial or not. So once you have your list of hypotheses, the best step is to iterate and do with research and feedback. So you can have this as a Google Doc. It could be a Lucid chart. It could be whatever way you find is the easiest to organize. And the key is to get feedback and iterate. One of the first things I did when I did this for my product Loop Browser is I went to internal stakeholders and I asked them, do you agree with this list? What do you think should be changed? And there's a lot of great conversation that can happen, especially if you lean on internal stakeholders that have different perspectives from you. For example, maybe your team members who are customer facing on a day-to-day basis, they may be able to give you a different view. Another quick way to jump in and do this is to analyze your sales and analytics patterns. So you might already have data that all you have to do is mine for the patterns and investigate. And you can even set up some experiments. So you could do this in a more detailed experimental fashion, or you can make a couple of new plots and perhaps refine some of the existing hypotheses. And the last step is to incorporate this into your continuous discovery. I have a great blog post by Jason Cohen that talks about how to do this that I'll cite. And I did this for Loop Browser where I took 3 months, where I took my hypotheses, converted them into questions, and spoke with customers once a week for those 3-month period. And I iterated on my hypotheses. And at the end of it, I was able to come out with a very coherent view of my product and its strategy. And because I was speaking with different stakeholders about the hypotheses throughout that process, I was able to bring them along that journey of the evolving strategy. And it was very, very effective. And I highly recommend it, although it is a bit time consuming. So for my goat pottery, I mostly focused on analyzing sales and talking to other crafters and customers. And I was able to refine and test my hypotheses. And surprisingly, my controversial hypothesis turned out true, but the other two that I thought were not controversial were not correct. And I was able to revise them further. And what I found from my sales and conversations is that actually customers don't care about having a one-of-a-kind product. They just want something unique. And I also found that lower priced items don't get you traction. Market rate gets you traction because lower price makes it cheap. And that's something I really didn't think about going into this. I always just thought cheaper was better. And with these revisions, I was able to actually fix one of my main hypotheses, which is that customers don't necessarily need intricate pieces. They want unique pieces. And this allows me to cut back on my time working on my pieces a lot. So that's the 5 steps. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you join us for the interactive session and connect with me on LinkedIn. These are the 4 main resources I highly recommend following up on if you have some time and interest, and they will be all linked in my slide deck. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of Women in Product 2023.